All right, so we're going to be looking at Eikev, right? And the very beginning of Eikev, the Torah portion of from last week, and which starts in Deuteronomy chapter 7, and really, it begins. Hello, Barbara.
I'm good.
And I'll just read the very beginning of the Torah portion, even though that's not the part we're going to be looking at. And so v'haya ekev tishma'un et hamishpatim ha'ela, and it shall come to pass because, or if you hearken to these ordinances and keep them and doing this, right? What's going to happen? All good stuff, right? And if not, what happens? Right?
Yes.
Ellen already knows, right? Because she was at shul with me on Saturday, right? Down, like down, everything bad, right? Which is a very complicated sort of way to look at the world, or maybe we should say, instead of it being complicated, right? We should acknowledge, right, that is a very simplistic way of looking at the world, right? That if you behave, if you follow the rules, right? I mean, there was just, and every once in a while you see, essays in the newspaper about this. I always thought if I raised my kids to follow the rules and to work hard and to do everything that they were supposed to do, what would happen? They would inherit the American dream and everything would be beautiful, right? But oh my God, my kids are now in their late 20s and they can't afford an apartment and they work 2 jobs and they're, right. And it's like, and somebody around here is getting really rich and having an easy time, on the backs of all these, so we all know this kind of a thing, right? That even in a secular context, right, this whole idea, if you just follow the rules, everything is going to be okay, right? We know, right, that doesn't really hold a lot of water, right? Yeah, go ahead, Barbara.
Many civilizations have this. Everybody.
Right. And so there's nothing unusual. Well, I mean, that's exactly, in fact, the point I'm trying to make, right? Is that because it says it in the Torah, right? Despite the fact that we very often want, Jewish civilization to be completely unique, right? And different than any other civilization in the world, right? The reality is that most human communities work on some sort of if-then theology, right? If this, then that, right? If you follow the rules, it'll all be good. If you don't follow the rules, then it's your own fault if you fail, right? But we all know that is just not the way the world works. So the one question might be, it's not the question I had in mind for today, but I'm happy to raise it, right? Is what is it about humans, right, that we persist, right, in this kind of thinking, right? That we have this kind of idea that the world is a recipe book, right? If, yesterday I made eggplant curry from one of my favorite cookbooks. If I do everything that the cookbook says, right, I'm going to end up with something that resembles eggplant curry. It may not be the best eggplant curry in the world, right? But it definitely is more or less eggplant curry, right? Whereas, if you followed the recipe for eggplant curry and you ended up with potato curry, you might be like, wait a second, this is not a very good cookbook. Or I looked at the wrong page, right? Or I tried to adapt, whatever. But the point is, right, that there are many many endeavors in our world where if we follow the instructions, we're going to end up with something that resembles our stated goal. And there are other places in our world that we know where we can, quote unquote, do everything right, and it all goes horribly wrong. So the question is, why would we build a theology on a recipe approach as opposed to the sort of what feels like a more realistic way? And that I don't have a good answer for that. Well, I don't have a pat answer for it. But what do you guys think? Why would that be the case?
Well, that's why we stick in the spiritual.
Right. So that there's a way in which, right, if I'm understanding you correctly, Gail, right, there's a way in which we can say, right, to ourselves, okay, it didn't work out, right, but at least we did what we thought was the right way to do things.
We tried.
We tried, right?
We tried our best.
We tried our best. We did what we were supposed to do. It didn't work out, right? And so when that happens, right, we could say, oh, this whole theology is bunk. Let's throw out the Torah, right? Which some people are happy to do, right? Or we could say it didn't work out, but we can take solace, we can take comfort, right, in the fact that we really were we were trying to live the life that we really wanted to live. And we understand, right, that despite these promises, right, we know that it's not a recipe book.
And give me strength.
Right. And let me have strength despite the fact, right, that we all know it doesn't work out. So that is one answer, right? That despite the fact that we know that there's no one-to-one correlation between our behavior and the outcomes of our lives, right? And in fact, we know for a fact, right, that people who do wrong, right, often end up apparently sitting pretty while the rest of us opening a hotel in the old post office in Washington, D.C., among other things, right? Yeah. That, there are some people who, that doesn't undermine the basic, and I think that's, for me, one of the deeper answers to why humans persist, right, in this if-then kind of theology, right, is because I think that we understand, right, that even though worldly success, right, or even security, or whether it's food security or just personal security or financial security, right, that won't necessarily come out of us behaving properly, right? But we do know that our behavior and what happens, right, are connected in some way, right? We know that our behavior has consequences. I don't think we take seriously this idea that there's a simple connection between, if I follow all of the rules in the Torah, everything is going to be great, right? But I do think we know that if we follow our own rules, whatever they are, right? If we follow our own ethical precepts, right, derived from the Torah or derived from some other source, right? If we live the life that we feel is important, right, even if things don't work out the way we might want them to, we at least know that we've lived according to our rules, right? And that's a big part, right, of feeling okay. Most of us wouldn't want to be the former president, right? Most of us look at the former president and go, "Oi, right? What an awful life to have to live."
Shonda.
Right? I mean, to live to live with that much shame, right? To live with that much fear, right? And with that much sort of with that fragile of an ego, right? No one in his or her right mind would want to live that. And it's really interesting, right, that so many people look at that type of person, right, and see a hero,
Admire him.
right, as opposed to pity him. All right.
Did he read it?
Well, pity is contempt, right? Have contempt for him, right?
Yeah,
It's not worth compassion, I think, necessarily.
Better.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think there is a way in which, I really do try not to have contempt for any person, right? I don't think contempt is a healthy feeling for the person having it, right? But it's hard not to.
To find.
It's hard. Compassion seems wasted on such a person.
To feel sorry.
Right.
Yeah.
It's one of these things where you think, just go away.
Right. Right. You just want him to go away. Right.
Yes.
And he's not the only person like, right? I mean, unfortunately, he is just the most visible and the most pervasive and one of the most destructive of these, but they all are destructive, right? All of these people bring nothing but chaos and destruction in their way.
Skip the psychologist.
Oh, he sure has. And his sister. I mean, his sister has made a fortune selling books, writing about her brother. I mean, more power to him. All right. So I want to look at this though, because I think that so are people familiar with the Shema? No. Okay. So so let's go through the Shema. And I'll just sort of, we won't read the whole thing, but the Shema is not a prayer, right? In any kind of a normal way that we think of prayer, right? Because it is really it's really an exhortation that we read from the Torah, right? And it's in the center of one of our sort of rubrics of prayer. It's called the Shema and its blessings, right? And there are blessings before the Shema, there are blessings after the Shema, and the center of it is the Shema itself. And the Shema can be as small as one line, right? Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, right? Hearken, right? Or hear, O Israel, or listen, all different ways of translating it, right? Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one, right? You can imagine that is it's a unity. Adonai is a unity. Adonai is everything. Adonai is one, right? All different ways of understanding it. So that's the single line of the Shema. Then there's a paragraph from Deuteronomy that follows that line immediately, right? That basically says, it's the famous one that says, Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, right? And you shall love your God, Adonai, your God, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, which could be your possessions, right? But again, different ways of understanding it, right? And then there's a series of verses that follow. That first paragraph of the Shema is accepted across all Jewish congregations. Maybe not the humanist ones, I don't know. But certainly all religious Jewish organizations accept that as the sort of the fundamental statement of faith. First of all, that God is a unity. And second of all, it's incumbent upon us to show love. And again, all different ways of understanding what that means. For God. Right? Then there is the second paragraph of the Shema, which we are going to look at, which not all Jewish congregations regard as a valid part of the Shema. And it'll be interesting to sort of wonder, well, why not? Right? So Reform congregations and some Reconstructionist congregations remove the second paragraph of the Shema, right? And it'll be interesting to sort of think about why. Then there is the third paragraph of the Shema, the first half of which talks about wearing the talis, right? Wearing tzitzit, right? And that the tzitzit are there, right? That God has given us the tzitzit to wear so that we follow the mitzvahs, that we follow God and we don't go off doing other things. And then the second half of that little paragraph, which is from the book of Numbers, talks about how this is all because God took us out of Israel, out of the land of Egypt, right? Why? To be our God. That was the whole point of it, right? And it's sort of a restatement of the fundamentally reciprocal relationship, right, between God and the Jewish people. And that's how the Shema ends. So the second half of that third paragraph is actually very often chanted out loud in congregations that omit the second paragraph and the first half of the third paragraph. So again, Reform and Reconstructionist congregations often will add that out loud, whereas in conservative and Orthodox congregations, by and large, the second two paragraphs of the Shema are said silent. You can read them, you don't need to. And this would always be my response to the Reform movement, to Reform Jews who are like, oh, I don't believe that, right? I'm like, the beauty of Jewish prayer is that by and large, so much of it is silent that you can read what you want. If you don't like it, read something else or meditate or whatever, right? But to take it away from the people who find it meaningful, right? I don't understand. But that's neither here nor there. I'm not a Reformed Jew, so I am, it's not. I don't want to speak for them. But I do think it's interesting to think about, well, why is this taken out? Right? So maybe what we'll do, maybe I'll just read through the entire second paragraph of the Shema, and then we can go through it a little bit more slowly. You okay? Everything all right?
Yeah. Would be two paragraphs up. The one where it fits,
Oh, you read it out loud.
would
You read the first one and the third out loud.
Yes.
Oh, interesting. What school do you go to?
well, everyone I've gone to.
Oh, interesting. Because most of the ones that I go to read just the first one out loud. And sometimes not even that one. Sometimes just we say the Shema out loud.
Yeah.
And then, so I'm very happy to be corrected that people read the, no, not corrected. Correct is the wrong word. To know that there's
Another.
even more variation.
Yeah.
Right. I'm very happy to be in life. Exactly. I'm always really. Yeah. There are popular. I'm sure there are congregations that read the third one out loud, but not the second one. You don't read the second one. The Hayim Shemoah. You read that one. Yeah.
Yes.
So the second one, right? So the second one that we're looking at right now on the screen,
Yes.
right, is V'hayim Shemoah Tishma'u. So if you will hear and obey the mitzvahs that I command you this day, to love and serve Adonai your God with all your heart and all your soul, then I will grant the rain for your land in season, rain in autumn and rain in spring. You shall gather in your grain and wine and oil. I will provide grass in your fields for your cattle, and you shall eat and be satisfied. Take care lest your heart be tempted, and you stray and serve other gods and bow down to them. Then Adonai's anger will flare up against you, and God will close up the sky, so that there will be no rain, and the earth will not yield its produce. You will quickly disappear from the good land that Adonai is giving you. Therefore, impress these words of mine upon your heart and upon your soul. Bind them as a sign upon your hand and as a symbol above your eyes. Teach them to your children by speaking of them when you sit down in your home, and when you walk on the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. Inscribe them upon the doorposts of your home and on your gates. Then your days and the days of your children on the land that Adonai swore to your ancestors to give them will be as many as the days that the heavens are above the earth. So that's the entirety of that paragraph. So why might some Jews say, oh, we've got to take this out of the prayer? Sorry?
You didn't,
Oh.
visual.
Yeah, so many pages that is.
I can't see that. 42. Which paragraph is that?
The top one in English, yeah. So, I mean, so I think, the obvious things, right, that would be a flag. There are two things in particular, I think, that, I would flag if I were the editor, say, of a Reformed prayer book. The first one would be, right, this idea that if you behave,
And
the rain will fall. And if you don't, what's going to happen? No rain. Right? And I would say, if I read this straight, if I read this just as it sits on the page, right, this is terribly simplistic. And it completely does not accord with real life, right? And it sets up, and I do think that this is a legitimate objection, right? It sets up a situation in which someone could say, oh, the rain didn't fall. What did I do wrong? And to sort of blame oneself for everything bad that happens. Right? And we all know people who do this, and probably most of us have done this, even if we're not strict religious believers, right? Oh, if only I had not done X, right? Everything would have been okay, right?
If then, but that's in the basic philosophy. No, there are many, but.
Right.
Remember.
Yeah, I don't remember. I mean, it might be. I mean, I want to say Kierkegaard, but I don't know if that's true, because I think of him as the either or guy, not the if then guy. But yeah, but no, but I do think, right, that there is. But I mean, again, as we said before, right, if you read this a little bit with a little bit more subtlety, right, if you read it as a poem rather than as an op-ed in the newspaper, right, then you can see, well, yeah, if I'm connected to God, and I am living in accordance with what I believe, whatever that is, right? Then I'm going to feel more watered, so to speak, right? I'm going to feel more fertile in my life, right? And because we all know, right? We all know the situation that's happened it happens to everybody, right? We behave in a certain way and we know that that's not consistent with who we are, right?
It's also not a pleasant God in this paragraph.
There's not a pleasant thought.
Why do we look for, why do we?
Don't we want a pleasant God?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, right? I mean, I think I think for me, the pleasant thought is, right, if I live in accordance, right, with my values and with what I take as my mitzvahs, right? Not allowing someone else to impose them on me, right? But right, if I live in accordance with my own heart, right, then my fields will be watered, right, to a certain extent, right? And how do I do that? What are the ways that I do that, right? It's the same, and this is, I think, the second thing I would say if I were an editor of a Reformed prayer book. I would say, wait, this is all the stuff that was in the first paragraph of the Shema. Why do I need this again? Right? The putting it on the doorposts of my house, and when I rise up and teaching it to my children, and this and that, and loving my God with all, why do I need this again? This is just repetition. Go ahead.
Well, it just might be that your expectations are exceeding whatever God is trying to say to you. And things don't always work exactly the way you imagine they're going to, whether you're being good or bad, things are going to happen. And you have to be flexible.
And I actually think that's a beautiful way of thinking about it, right? Because what is it, right? Take care lest your heart be tempted, right? And maybe your heart being tempted and serving other gods is just sort of having unrealistic expectations about what your life should be, right? And if you have unrealistic expectations, whatever they are, right? And it doesn't have to be, oh, I'm going to be as beautiful as Gisele Bündchen, right? It could, or I'm going to be as rich as Tom Brady, right? I mean, actually, I think she's richer than he is. But the point is, right? But the point is, right, that, it doesn't have to be way out of line, right, for it to be unreasonable, right? And for expectations to lead to levels of dissatisfaction, right, that make it feel like your fields aren't being watered.
Well, none of us are perfect. And I think the whole goal is to do our very best at what God wants of us. And if we don't manage it sometimes, we have to try better the next time.
Right.
And this is from my point of view, as you know, I'm still learning. But this is all interesting and relevant to what you're saying and what the others are understanding.
Right. And I think, right, and so one response, right, to the objection that I raised, right, and this might be helpful for you to think about as well, right, is that the first paragraph of the Shema really is in the second person singular, right? You individually have to do stuff, right? And the second paragraph really is very largely, not exclusively, but largely in the second person plural, right? That it's about families and communities. And so that what you're saying, right, about you've got to try your hardest to sort of live according to what you feel God wants you to do, right, functions at these multiple levels, right? Obviously, each person has to do it, right? But also each community has to kind of figure out, well, how are we going to live?
And think of the community as one person.
And thinking of the community as some sort of a unity, right? And I think that's very hard, right? It's very hard because very often, I mean, especially in today's world, right, where there's such an emphasis on individuality, right, and individualism, right? That what I mean, the sort of this constant refrain, like it's a free country, I can do what I want, right? Oi, yes, but you sort of miss the point, right? If we can't all sort of agree upon how do we understand that freedom, right? There's got to be some sort of collective understanding of that. All right, so let's look here. We'll look just at the first line, right? V'haya im shemoa. If then you will obey the commandments that I enjoin upon you today, right? Loving your God and serving God with all your heart and all your soul, right? Very interesting, right? That serving God to a certain extent is incumbent upon loving God. So that the relationship between those two acts, right, is that service is sort of part and parcel of love, which I think is really, really interesting. Because when we think of service, right, we very often think of customer service. Right. And I mean, at least in this country, right, it can be very transactional, right, as opposed to relation. And I think that that's one thing, right, that's very important here, right, that there's this sort of idea of there's this relationship, right? Now, does this require belief in a personal God? And I think that's a really interesting question, right? Because I do think for a lot of people that's a real stumbling block, right? I can't quite believe in God as a person, right? So how can I have a relationship to God if I don't have that kind of belief? But I don't know if that resonates with anybody in the room. I just know that,
Hello?
all right. But I think what's really interesting here.
Hold on. Okay, what? What happened with me?
All right. So I just want to point out one thing I learned this week, right? If you look at the word v'haya, right, the very first word. Oh, sorry. If you look at this very first word, you'll see, right, that it has the same collection of letters. There you go, vault. It has the same collection of letters as does God's name. And so that there's this way in which, right, God is there right in that first word. Right? And of course, does anyone know what Vahaya means literally? There's no if necessarily here. The if is in the probably, which can mean also and. And it's sort of like and it was, right? Or and it will be. So Vahaya is a form of the verb to be.
Well,
Right. If you will. But it's very interesting, right? If it is the case, Vahaya, if it is such, right? If it is, right, that you do this. So this emphasis of God being God's name in Hebrew, Yud He Vav He, in a sense, being the combination of all of the tenses of the verb to be, right? Gets at a sense right away, right? Of okay, this is one way of understanding God in Judaism, right? That doesn't necessarily require a personal God. I mean, there's nothing wrong with a personal God, but if you struggle with that, right, one way of thinking of it, right, is that God really is all tenses, all time, all being. All right. So what does Rashi say? Right? And this is, I think, also very important, right? And to serve him with all your heart. What does it mean to serve God?
It's like this, in the midst of.
To do the mitzvahs, right? And to pray, right? Which is really interesting, right? Why does Rashi focus on prayer as avodah?
We don't have a temple.
Because we don't have a temple, right? Is that in the Torah, very often avodah almost always means the sacrificial system, right? The temple, right? And to sort of focus on the fact, right, that Rashi and the rabbis will find even in the Torah, right? They will try to prove that service can be not sacrifice in the temple. It can be prayer, right? And as we go on, right, it leads to being along the lines of doing all the mitzvahs, right, to a certain extent, right? And I like to think of it as, again, like, where do we get so much joy in our lives, right? Where do we feel so much love, right? We often feel love and joy when we serve other people, right? When we help other people, especially if we do it sort of freely, right? If we do it without sort of like, oh, I'm going to do this for someone and they're going to pay me money, right? Or they're going to give me admiration, right? If we do it, quote unquote, selflessly, right, in this kind of slightly paradoxical way, that becomes the source of the greatest reward. All right, so we'll continue, right? And I will grant the rain for your land in season, right? The early rain and the late, you shall gather in your new grain and wine and oil. I will provide grass in the fields for your cattle, right? And I'm just going to point, I don't know if Rashi points this out or someone else points this out later, right? They say that the Torah includes this to remind you that if you have animals, you need to feed them before you feed yourself.
I do that with my cat.
Yes, right. It's, there is a, if you have animals and you have food for both of you, feed the cat first and then feed yourself. Right.
Particularly if you want to eat.
Oh, and it might be because if you want to eat in peace, you got to feed the dog. Right. Yes.
That.
Yeah. And thus you shall eat your fill. And take care not to be lured away to serve other gods and to bow to them. Right. Right. That is the thing, right? That you don't want to end up serving other gods. Right. And here's Rashi on this, right? When you have eaten and are full, take heed to yourselves that you do not kick against God. For usually no man rebels against the Holy One, blessed be he, except out of satiety. As it is said, lest thou eat and are full, and thy herds and thy flocks increase, right? And what is stated after that, and thy heart be lifted up, and thou forget the Lord thy God. Right? And it's not coincidental, I think, that in this parsha, right, in Eikev is basically the line, remember that you didn't build it yourself. Do you remember in the 2012 presidential campaign, right, there was a big fight between Obama and Romney, right? And Obama was the Jew and Romney was, I guess, the Mormon, right? Because Obama said, look, anything that anybody builds in this country, right, is built on the labor and the work of the people that came before them, right? Which is basically the point of Deuteronomy. Right? That if you allow yourself to take credit for everything that's happened, right, that is essentially idolatry. And so Rashi is saying, right, don't get too big for your britches. And it's very interesting because, right, that idolatry here becomes sort of a sense of like, well, I'm actually God. Right? I actually am the creator. And ye turn aside and depart from the Torah, and through this ye will serve other gods. And for soon as soon as a man departs from the Torah, he goes and clings to idol worship. And similarly to David say, for they have driven me out this day that I should cleave to the not cleave to the inheritance of the Lord, go serve other gods. But who had really said this to him? He meant really, I'm driven out, so I can no longer occupy myself with Torah, so I am likely to serve other gods. Again, I think our attitude towards this these days is probably a little different, right? That it's not so much that we have to have exclusive adherence to the Torah, right? But I think we sort of understand it more as we need to remember who we are, right? And to remember where Torah and Judaism fit into that, right? And to make sure that we are living according to that and not according to some other person's idea of what life should be like. And this one I love, right? V'chara af Adonai ba'chem v'atzar et hashamayim v'lo yihi matar. So, and for God's anger will flare up against you, shutting up the skies so that there will be no rain and the ground will not yield its produce. And you will soon perish from the good land that Adonai is assigning to you. Therefore, impress these my words upon your heart. Right? And again, we're familiar with this from the previous paragraph. Right? Bind them as a sign on your hand and let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. Right. And so what's interesting here, V'haya af Adonai bachem. So my teacher says, look, you can read it as God's wrath being upon you, right? Or essentially that God's wrath will rise up in you, right? Bachem, ba is one of these prepositions in Hebrew that can mean in, on, by means of, through, right? And so one way of reading this is not so much that God is going to rain anger down on you, right? But rather that you are going to feel, right, you're going to feel this cognitive dissonance. You're going to be angry for no reason. Right? You're going to experience rage against yourself, against other people, whatever it is, right? Because, as you said before, life is suddenly not meeting my expectation. And I have this idea that things should be something else, not what they are. You got to go, Barbara? Time for lunch?
No, it's not time for lunch. It's Saturday.
What? Oh,
I don't. It's a little much right now.
oh, you don't. I'm sorry, Barbara. Okay. Come by and see me. We can talk about it if you want. Okay.
You're now. We have it.
And teach them to your children, reciting them when you stay at home and when you are away, and when you lie down and when you get up, and inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates, to the end that you and your children may endure in the land that Adonai swore to your fathers to assign to them, as long as there is a heaven over the earth.
Is Hakkai anything ever?
Hashemayim, yep.
How do you say it?
Hashemayim, yeah,
Making a song.
yeah. And this I love, right? Rashi, like the rabbis in general, are trying to figure out how can we say that eternal life is a biblical origin, right? As you may remember or not from previous conversations that we've had, right? The idea of eternal life is not something we find in the Torah, it comes later, either in the prophets or in the rabbis, right? So one of the jobs that the rabbis set for themselves is to find any hint they can possibly find in the Torah that we can assign that meaning to Moses, right? And God in the Torah, rather than having it be something that comes later. This is one of the things, right? They say, is it not written? It is not written here to give to you, but to give to them. Right? And from this, we are able to derive that the tenet of the resurrection of the dead is a biblical origin, and from the Torah, not from later. So what I really like, right? Oops, sorry. But again, one of the things that I think is really powerful about this, again, reading this section a little differently, right? That in order, right, that you may increase the days and the days of your children upon the land, so on and so forth, right? And that God will give to them, right? And presumably also to us, right? Himei hashamayim al haaretz, right? That we will be given days that are like being in heaven, right here on earth. That there will be days. There are days in our lives, right?
Right now.
That are truly wonderful, right? There are moments in our life where we feel
Right.
complete joy, right? And it may be that, well, actually things are not completely great, right? But we feel that way anyway. Right. But of course, we can't have days that are only that, right? We can't have only days like that. There will be other days. And again, and for me, this sort of gets back to this, and this again is from one of so that translation of it comes from Reb Zalman, Schachter Shalomi, who was the founder of Renewal Judaism. He was a former Chabadnik, who decided he didn't like the non-egalitarian ways of Chabad, and he decided to take a lot of the Chabad, what he considered the good stuff about Chabad, and bring it into a more egalitarian liberal context. And one of the things that, that Hasidic way of looking at the Torah is that you're allowed to take little snippets of the Torah out and translate them the way that they really work for you, right? And for him, right, it really works to remember, right, that there are going to be days here on earth that are just like they are in heaven, right? What we imagine heaven to be like. And that's one of the ways, right, that we get through the fact that life isn't always the way we want it to be, right? Because sometimes it is.
There's an old expression in the 70s about going with the flow.
Yes.
That's what I think you're saying, and a bit in a more, reverent way. But yeah.
But I love that. But it's not just going with the flow, because I think when we say I'm going with the flow, right? It's not just, it's more just like, well, things are kind of bad, but I'm going along with it, right? I think what this going with the flow is, right, is to recognize, right, that the flow includes moments of flood, right, where we're completely overwhelmed and terrified. And there are moments of flow, of actual flow, right, where we feel like we are somehow miraculously in tune with the universe and in tune with other people. And we are going to just rise in that great joy of being in that level of harmony, right? And so, yes, it is going with the flow in the sense that we recognize that, yeah, over time, things are gonna even out, right? And it's not all gonna be wonderful, but it also won't always be all terrible, which is hard to remember, right? election day 2016, it didn't seem like things would ever be okay again. Right? When your spouse leaves you, you don't necessarily feel like everything's going to be okay. If you have some sort of a health catastrophe, it doesn't seem like everything is ever going to be okay again. Right? And then lo and behold,
There you are.
there you are, and you have sometimes much sooner than you ever expected a day of great joy. And you're like, wait, how can this coexist? So the way that I love to read this, is actually, I mean, and it is interesting, right? It's almost not to read it as an if. Right? It's not to read it as an if. It's basically to sort of say, well, there are going to be days when the rain falls in the season and my animals have everything they need, and I'm in this great moment of harmony and joy. And there are going to be these other moments when it's full bore catastrophe. Right? And I need to, regardless of which one of those I happen to be living through on a given day, right? I still need to remain connected. I still need to be fully me. So I want to just read really quickly. I'll read to you. So I got much of this came from my teacher, Art Green. So let me read. I'll read a little bit quickly from his piece on this, if I can find it, of course, big if. There it is. All right, so he says, I take this second paragraph of the Shema to describe the great journey that is the life of faith. Once you know in your heart that Yod-Heh Vav-Heh is one, you are going to set out on that journey. Know in advance that it's going to be a bumpy ride. It contains moments of seemingly boundless spiritual fulfillment and reward, but there are also times of fear, loneliness, and disappointment. And they are all part of the roller coaster. But our faith, right, and this I think is the faith that both of you have mentioned at different times in the course of this hour, right, that Hashem is present in all of them and binds them together. That we can make a unity of the good and the bad. And perhaps that's why this passage begins with the word Vahaya, as I mentioned before, right? Which is nothing other than Yod-Heh Vav-Heh in hidden form, right? It's an anagram. And sometimes you just have to turn the letters around to rediscover the name and God's presence. The passage begins with La'ahava, right? It appears as though the noun has been replaced with the verb. The noun has replaced the verb, right? It's not lehov, to love in the usual verbal form, but la'ahava, right? To be in the state that can only be described as one. There's a warning here not to take the second paragraph of the Shema too simplistically, right? And I think that's always the problem, right? Almost always the problem with theology is that we're going to take it too simplistically, right? Which is different than simple, right? Taking it simplistically. The simple or childlike reading of this passage tells us if we really love God, lots of good things will come our way. And if we don't, you better watch out. That sort of childlike faith doesn't work for adults because we know it doesn't work that way. But we have something else. We have an understanding of la'ahava, of the state of being in love, as something that is the potential to transform our vision. The experience of being in love has the power to change the way we approach life's journey. If we learn to look through the eyes of love, we may see our world, the same world, with the same pain, the losses, and the same arbitrariness in a different way. We will learn to accept life and the world in which we live with all its faults as only longtime lovers can. How much we learn to accept those we accept in those we love, right? We put up with so many things. Right? I get you rolling your eyes, right? So 58 years, you have some stories to tell. Yeah. Right. And so too, and I think this is one of the things, right? The marriage, the metaphor of marriage, right, in the relationship between us and God, right, is we often forget, right, that it's not just about a simple sort of sunny love, right? It's about, well, accepting that not everything is what we would want. When we do that, we can receive the real reward this passage promises, right? And this is where I think we'll stop here, right? As our teacher Reb Zalman translated, Ki Yamei Hashamayim al Haaretz, right? Heavenly days right here on earth. All right, so thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Ellen. All right.
Don't forget the.
No, I will not forget. We're good to go. I don't remember. I don't think so. I think I'm supposed to not be here.
But you're here a week from Friday.
Yeah, I believe it.